Hello, I'm Auxiliaries Inspector Lieutenant Commander John Letourneau, and I'm going to walk you through an Anchor Windless system check. This is for an auxiliaries check, not a deck check. The deck guys are going to be topside. This is for the Anchor Windless portion of the anchor check. And I'm going to walk you through this. This is a DDG, one of the newer class DDGs. So we have an electric motor as our prime mover for this system. Obviously, you know that most of the ships in the Navy are hydraulically operated prime movers. So this is just going to kind of walk you through the a motor system, how we look at this and what we look for. We typically, obviously, this is the motor, gearbox, and then you got your brake and your clutch system all the way up into your anchor windlass up top side. So we're responsible basically everything from the weather deck down, and that's what we're looking at. Now what we typically do is we start by looking at the linkage, and the reason we do that is because linkage is very important, whether it's hydraulic or a motor operated system. For the hydraulic operated system, we're obviously concerned with two different linkages. We're looking at the brake linkage, and we're looking at the hydraulic linkage or the stroke control linkage. So in this case, since it's an electric pump, we're just focusing on the brake linkage. And this is important because if there's a pin missing or loose and it works itself free, then you could possibly have a runaway anchor and not be able to secure it with the brake, and then you have to go into emergency actions. And we don't want to have that. So we like to look at that first. So the way we do this is we actually get up and we'll actually inspect all these pins, all these locking mechanisms, all these keys, everything as we go through from basically from the weather deck down. And we're making sure that our portion of the brake has all the appropriate linkages, pins, and locking devices, and anything else that the NSTM and the PMS calls for. So that's the first thing we inspect. And then we typically will work our way over to the brake linkage. We're going to make sure that our linkage, our cotter pins are in, and the appropriate pin, and they're set the appropriate way. Make sure nothing's going to sneak out of here. We're going to check all of our linkage. We're going to check that any yokes and operational portions of this anchor brake are intact, and we're not going to have any runaway anchor on our watch. So we're going to look for that. We're also going to check that our clutch, same type of thing. Make sure that the clutch linkage and the clutch mechanism is all intact. So we'll do all this typically before we even start the checks. For anchor, there's three checks that we do. We call it the import cold check, and then there's an import hot check, and then there's an underway demo. For the cold check, that's when we typically will check our linkages and all that stuff. We'll actually come in here and we'll do the basic checks without actually starting anything, just like any other cold check. And when we do the cold check, we'll also check the brake pad thickness. We'll make sure that we'll actually do the brake PMS. Most of the PMS card that actually calls for checking the adjustment of the brake. This is a DDG, so we're checking all these. We're checking some different adjustments, all in accordance with the PMS to make sure that this system is it's set the way it's supposed to. We found on a lot of ships of various classes that the maintenance isn't being done properly, and a lot of times we have misadjusted brake bands, and that can obviously cause to a brake system that doesn't work properly, and you can lead to that runaway anchor. So in this case, we're make sure we're going to check the brake pad thickness in accordance with the PMS. We're going to make sure that the brake pads, they open, they release, and they set in conjunction with one another, and are spaced equally on both sides. That's all in accordance with the PMS and tech manual. And we're going to check the drum, make sure there's no scoring, and make sure that the brake pads are actually in contact evenly around the circumference of the brake drum. So that's all stuff that we look at when we do the cold checks. And we'll also check that stuff during the at-sea demo, the anchor drop demo too. So we kind of check on this stuff both cold and under load when we're paying out and retrieving the anchor. So once we're happy with all the linkages and the basic mechanical aspects of this system, our oil levels proper. Like in this case, we do have oil in this system because of that gearbox. So we're going to make sure that we have indication. As you can see, there's oil indication here. We've got oil in the system. Now, unfortunately, on the DDGs, sometimes this thing's real finicky. So a lot of ships will cut it close to have it low, and then if it cools down in here, it'll be below gauge glass level. And unfortunately, if it's below the gauge glass level, we don't know if it's completely empty or just below the gauge glass level. So that's an RBO. And we've had some DDGs, especially these newer class DDGs, we've come on board and found those low, and then we have to RBO the system. And unfortunately, it takes some time to get that oil in there, and then we can get started. So just keep that in mind. I know it's finicky, but make sure you get level in that when we come up to start the check. We're going to check the overall material condition of the motor itself. Make sure that it's properly intact. All your fasteners are good. Make sure that the motor terminal junction box is intact. Make sure this cover's on, it's tight. Make sure your connections are good. Make sure there's no electrical safety hits. That goes with all the wiring and the motor itself. Along those lines, we check that the variable frequency motor controller is intact. The door's properly closed. You got your vent grading, all this stuff. Just your basic electrical safety checks on this. And that's for your cold checks. And then for your hot checks, we're going to also check your motor amperage as we go through the check. And that's a good indicator of the health of the entire system. Because obviously if the motor amperage isn't doing what we expect it to do, then that's a really good indication that you have a problem somewhere. Something's binding up, something like that. If you just start paying that anchor out and those amps are high, then you suspect that maybe you're binding something up. Because that motor amperage should be at its max when you're all the way paid out and just start retrieving that anchor. That's when you should see your max amps. So we look for things like that. So with all that said, like I said, the three portions that we go through are the import cold check, import hot checks, where we actually do the no load. We actually will run the no load just like you do in the PMS, and we'll check all your any interlocks associated with the system. We'll check those. Like for instance, for a hydraulic system, you have the stroke control interlock. We'll check that. So we're going to check interlocks, and we're going to check operation of the system itself under the no load condition. So we'll check all that. We'll go through the no load check. We're checking our indicators. We're checking our, in this case, your operator. We're going to make sure all this works properly, and we'll check as the brake is operated and as the clutch is operated. We're going to check all that stuff, make sure that it operates properly. In addition to that, this is a DDG, like I said. We have chain compressors. So the chain compressors, basically these are operated with air, low pressure air, and these air cylinders operates this arm, and then this chain compressor arm here that actually clamps your chain, and it's another safety device that you have to make sure that your anchor chain doesn't go anywhere you don't want it to go. So what we do is we're going to check these flex hoses. We're going to check the flex hose ID tags. We're going to check for air leaks on the different portions of the system, and we're going to check for operation as we do the demo. We're going to check for operation of these chain compressors, make sure that they operate properly. In addition to that, we're going to check the actuators. These are your actuators for your chain compressor. We're going to make sure these are operating properly. Now, they typically will operate the chain compressor's top side, but we'll see the actuators move, and we'll obviously hear it because it's air. And so we'll make sure that these are intact, make sure the labels, make sure they're not leaking. We do typically find on the DDGs, we do on this area, this manifold here, we typically find 1 or 2 minor air leaks. So make sure you check for that when you're going through your system. We also tend to find some corrosion on these due to dissimilar metals. Typically there's this one's good. This one's all non-ferrous. A lot of times we find ferrous and non-ferrous materials mixed right in here, and it causes almost instant corrosion up here because of the moisture. So make sure you check your ship for that too. That's a common find on newer class DDGs. We're going to check, make sure you've got the appropriate posted placards. So we're looking for the posted placards, everything from your lubrication placard to your operational placards and your safety placards. We're looking at that stuff. So make sure that you've got your placards up to date, make sure they're posted, make sure they're not peeling off the bulkhead, and we're looking at all that stuff. So when we're doing the operation check, we're going to do just like you're used to for an anchor drop check for PMS. We're going to pay it out, and as we're retrieving it, we're actually going to check the power loss, do the power loss check, and we're going to make sure that your electric brake is operating properly. So that's a pretty simple check on this ship, because it's, the electric brake, it's kind of a no-go, and we'll check that, make sure that it sets properly when we secure power. Depending on the class of ship, when we do the cold checks, we don't like to take these electric brakes apart. So what we like to do is as much of the cold check, much of the PMS check as we can without actually taking them apart. Now, the inspector does have the right to ask you to do the entire check. However, we don't like to take things apart. We don't have to. So what we'll typically do is take the portions of the check that we can do without taking the system apart. If we can just take off an access plate or something like that, and do a partial check on the electric brake, just enough so we can check the pad thickness or the air gap thickness, things like that. We'll do that. And then if we suspect there's more to it, there's an issue, then we might have you do the entire check. So we get a lot of questions on that, so that's why I wanted to bring that up. So other than the operational check all the way through, then we'll do just the basic material conditional checks, for things like paint, labels, you get your wires, your junction boxes. We'll check all that stuff. Even though we're auxiliaries, we look at that stuff because we find a lot of electrical safety hits on auxiliary gear. So that pretty much concludes my anchor check, and I hope you learned something. Thank you.